3,500 years ago, when Moses led Israel through the desert, they had no army, no weapons, and no military training. Yet they survived surrounded by hostile nations. Today, Israel has 169,500 active military personnel, nuclear capabilities, and the most advanced military technology on Earth. The contrast is shocking, but here's what makes this transformation truly mind-blowing. Both versions of Israel claimed divine protection, just in completely different forms. The reason will challenge your understanding of faith and progress. Have you ever wondered what turns helpless people into powerful nations? The story of Israel's army reveals God's extraordinary plan unfolding through time. Look back to those first moments of freedom. God's people had just escaped Egypt's chains. They weren't warriors, just brickmakers and shepherds. Their only experience with weapons came from watching Egyptian guards patrol prison yards. Yet the Lord had greater plans for his people. Through 40 years in the harsh desert, surrounded by fierce enemies, not one nation dared to strike them down. Their children played within sight of hostile armies, but God's protection stayed firm. When threats arose, the Lord fought for his people. Walls of fire blazed against their foes. Waters parted at his command. The very ground split open to swallow their enemies. Therefore, what happened next shows God's wisdom at work. Those same former slaves began to learn. They studied. They grew stronger. The Lord blessed their efforts with understanding beyond measure. Now peer through time's window to today's Israel. Their military ranks 17th in global power, but this barely tells the full story. The Lord's hand still guides them, but through different means. Where once stood walls of fire, now stands the Iron Dome, a shield that catches enemy missiles in mid-flight, using radar and artificial intelligence. In mere seconds, it tracks incoming threats, calculates their paths, and destroys them mid-air. The transformation runs deeper than mere technology. Israel now fields 169,500 active military personnel. Their arsenal includes F-35 stealth fighters, satellite systems that can spot a single person in the desert, and advanced cyber warfare capabilities. Those former slaves now teach other nations how to defend themselves. Their weapons now guard the innocent. Their innovations save lives across the globe. But here's what truly makes you pause and think. Behind every missile defense system, beside every radar screen, Israel's warriors still bow their heads in prayer. They've learned to work alongside God's miracles rather than simply wait for them. These soldiers combine unwavering faith with relentless innovation. This truth points to an even greater mystery in God's plan. The way he transforms weakness into strength reveals patterns that stretch far beyond Israel's story. His methods of protection have evolved, but his purpose remains unchanged. What other mysteries lie hidden in this divine plan? The answer begins with a burning question about that ancient pillar of fire. God's fiery pillar in the desert wasn't just a light. It was the start of a plan that would last thousands of years. To see this amazing truth, we need to look at how God protects his people, both then and now. Think of that mighty fire reaching up into the night sky. It did three big things. It showed God's people where to go, kept their camps safe, and proved he was always with them. Not a single enemy dared to come near while God's light watched over them. But God's ways often surprise us. Look at Israel today. They still watch the same desert skies, but now through tools God helped them create. Special radar machines can spot danger hundreds of miles away. High above, satellites keep watch day and night. These new guards can see things as small as a person walking in the sand. God's protection didn't go away. It just changed form. Instead of holy fire, they now use streams of information to stay safe. Army leaders can see everything happening in the desert right away. Their weapons hit targets so perfectly that the people of old would have called it a miracle. But here's something wonderful. Israel's soldiers still pray before every mission. Their trust in God is just as strong. They just use both God's power and man-made tools to stay safe. It's like they've learned to work hand in hand with God's gifts. This mix of faith and new tools shows us something special about God's plan. Just like the pillar of fire watched over Israel day and night, today's systems never stop working. Where God's light once showed them danger, special night cameras now help them see in the dark. But this change leads us to an even bigger truth about how God works. His next lesson would change everything about living in the desert. Even the best tools can't solve one basic problem in the desert: finding food. The way God helped his people handle this tells an amazing story of faith and wisdom. Long ago, God's people woke each morning to find a special gift. A layer of white flakes covered the ground, manna, bread from heaven itself. They could only gather enough for one day. If anyone tried to save extra, it would rot before sunrise. God wasn't just feeding them, he was teaching them to trust him daily. Today, Israel faces the same harsh desert, but God has given them a different kind of wisdom. Their army has created special meals that stay good even in burning heat. These meals give soldiers exactly what they need to stay strong. But God's people didn't stop there. They've done something that would seem impossible to their ancestors. They've made food grow in sand. Using new ways to farm without soil, they've turned empty desert into gardens. Now, both soldiers and families have fresh food in places where nothing should grow. Special tracking systems watch every meal's journey through the desert. Soldiers in far outposts get fresh supplies, right on time every time. What once needed God's direct help now works through the wisdom he gave his people. But this change led to an even bigger surprise in God's plan. Because in the desert, knowing where danger lurks matters as much as having food. The way Israel spots danger has changed greatly through time. Long ago, God's prophets warned of coming threats. Today, a different kind of guardian keeps watch, and their methods would amaze those ancient holy men. Take Samuel, God's mighty prophet. When he prayed, God showed him enemy plans through dreams and signs. These warnings from heaven kept God's people safe. No army could catch them by surprise because the Lord revealed every hidden plot. But in 1949, God's plan took an amazing turn. Israel started something new: the Mossad. Instead of waiting for dreams from heaven, they began finding threats through careful watching and special tools. Where prophets once got heavenly signs, officers now look at pictures from space. Smart computers study thousands of clues to spot coming dangers. This change shows God's special wisdom. The prophets protected one nation, but the Mossad now helps keep people safe all over the world. They work with other countries in ways the ancients never could have dreamed of. This new way costs more than the old. Prophets only needed faith to hear God's voice. Today's watchers need lots of money, complex machines, and many trained people. They can't say, "God told me" anymore. They must study many facts to find the truth. Yet one thing stays the same. Just as Samuel helped guide kings long ago, today's watchers help leaders make wise choices. God's protection didn't go away. It grew into something bigger. But knowing about danger isn't enough. You need strong walls too. And what God did with Israel's defenses tells an even more amazing story. When Joshua faced Jericho's mighty walls, he had only trumpets and faith. Today's Israel stops rockets with math and split-second timing. Both seem like miracles in their own way. Think of Jericho's huge walls. They stood like mountains against God's people. But God gave strange orders. March around the city 7 days with just trumpets. On the last day, their shouts and horns made those walls fall flat without touching them. Now jump to today. Israel has built something called the Iron Dome, a shield you can't see that stops rockets in the sky. Where Joshua used trumpets, this new guard uses smart computers. These machines figure out where enemy rockets will fly and shoot them down mid-air. The difference in cost tells us much. Joshua's army paid nothing to bring down walls. They just needed faith. But each time the Iron Dome shoots down a rocket, it costs up to $100,000. Yet both ways needed perfect timing. Joshua's men had to follow God's orders exactly. March 7 days, blow horns at just the right moment. Today's computers must make choices faster than humans can think, hitting rockets that fly quicker than sound. The Iron Dome does things that seem impossible. It can watch many rockets at once, solve hard math problems in tiny moments, and hit targets in the dark sky. But here's something special. Many soldiers still pray before working at the Iron Dome controls. They know that whether through trumpet blasts or computers, God keeps them safe. But this new way of fighting changed more than just walls. What happened next with Israel's army leaders would have amazed Moses himself. The way Israel picks its leaders has changed in ways that would amaze their ancestors. This story shows how God guides his people through different times. Long ago, God chose tribal chiefs through burning bushes and mighty signs. These leaders made choices by praying and seeking God's wisdom. Signs from heaven proved God had picked them, and no one could doubt their right to lead. But look at Israel's army today. Instead of 12 tribes, they have 3 main parts: ground forces, air force, and navy. Where Moses once got orders from God on a mountain, today's leaders work in rooms full of screens showing battles happening right now. The way they pick leaders has changed too. God showed the old tribes their chiefs through miracles. But today's commanders earn their place through years of training and proving their skills. They must know about fighting methods, new tools, and how to lead others well. These new leaders use tools their ancestors never dreamed of. Instead of waiting for signs in dreams, they study pictures from space and reports from all over. Special computers help them spot dangers and find the best ways to keep people safe. Yet here's something wonderful. Many commanders still pray before big choices. They've learned to use both God's wisdom and new knowledge. Their command rooms don't look like the old tribal tents, but their job stays the same, keeping God's people safe in a dangerous world. But this new way of leading was just the start. The tools these commanders would use next show an even more amazing change in God's plan. David stood in the valley of Elah with just 5 smooth stones and a sling. Today's Israel fights with tools that would seem like magic to that young shepherd. This change tells us an amazing story about God's wisdom. Think of David facing Goliath. His weapon was simple, just leather and cord. But it wasn't just the sling that made him strong. David knew God guided his hands. Years of protecting sheep gave him skill, but faith gave him courage. That one stone guided by God brought down a giant. Now look at Israel's weapons today. Their F-35 planes fly higher than birds, carrying special bombs that can hit things smaller than Goliath's shield. Where David had to get close to use his sling, today's soldiers can strike from miles away, using signals from space. These new weapons work in ways David never dreamed of. They can change path while flying, move around things in their way, and hit exactly where needed. Instead of watching stones fly, soldiers now use smart computers to guide their weapons. Yet something stays the same. Just as David picked his stones with care, today's soldiers plan each strike carefully. They use their tools to avoid hurting innocent people, just as David aimed only at the giant. The cost shows how much things have changed. David's sling cost almost nothing. Today's weapons cost millions. But both need something money can't buy: wisdom to use them right. But keeping people safe takes more than good weapons. What Israel built next would have amazed their ancestors even more. When God led Israel through the desert, he gave Moses a special map for their camps. Today's bases look very different, but they teach us something amazing about how God protects his people. In those first camps, every tribe knew their exact spot around God's holy tent. They didn't have walls. They stayed safe by watching from high places and trusting God's protection. His presence at the center of camp kept them safer than any wall could. Today's bases still use those old wise ways, but with new tools that would seem like magic to Moses. Those same hills where guards once stood now have special sensors that can feel a single footstep from miles away. Instead of tribal areas, they have security rings that protect important places. The old camps could move when God led his people to new places. They didn't need strong walls because God watched over them. But today's bases stay in one spot, built with thick concrete and steel. Special systems watch every path leading to them, day and night. Yet look closely and you'll see God's old wisdom in these new places. Just like the tribes guarded God's tent, Today's bases keep their most important buildings in the middle, with rings of protection around them. The high ground that helped ancient guards see danger now holds towers with radar and watching tools. Many soldiers still pray before guard duty, even with all these new tools. Their bases cost millions to build and run, while the old camps just needed faith. But both ways served one purpose: keeping God's people safe in dangerous lands. Yet staying safe needs more than strong walls. What happened next with how God's people shared news would amaze their ancestors even more. In ancient times, God's people used a special horn called the shofar to send messages. Today's soldiers use tools that send secret codes across the world in less than a blink. This change tells us something special about how God helps his people stay connected. The shofar was simple but powerful. This curved ram's horn could blast messages for miles across the desert. Each sound meant something different: time to fight, celebrate winning, or warn of danger. Every warrior knew these signals by heart. Better yet, enemies couldn't stop or change these holy messages. Today's Israeli soldiers use very different tools. Their radios use special codes that change every second. Smart computers turn their words into secret patterns that only friends can understand. Where the shofar's mighty call rang out for all to hear, today's messages travel quietly through the air, hidden from enemies. Yet each way has its strengths. The shofar never needed power or fixing. It worked in any weather and never broke down. Today's tools need constant power and care, and sometimes fail when needed most. Still, both old and new ways serve one goal: keeping God's people safe and connected in battle. Whether through a holy horn's clear call or silent secret signals, Israel's warriors always find ways to share life-saving messages. But sending messages quickly wasn't enough. What happened next would have made Moses stop and wonder. God's people spent 40 years walking through the desert, each step taken by foot. Today, Israel's fighters zip through the sky faster than sound. This change shows us something amazing about God's plan. Those first freed people could only move as fast as their slowest walker. When danger came, they had to trust their feet and God's guidance to escape. A divine cloud led them forward through the wild lands. Now look at Israel's F-35 planes. These amazing machines can do things Moses would have thought only God could do. They fly so high, enemies can't see them. They hide from radar that tries to spot them. In minutes, they cover distances that took their ancestors weeks to walk. This new speed changed everything about staying safe. Long ago, enemies needed days or weeks to attack. Now threats can come in minutes, but Israel's response is just as quick. Their planes can reach any spot in the country faster than their ancestors could pack up camp. Where old warriors had to look their enemies in the eye, today's pilots can protect their people from far above the clouds. Smart computers help them find their way through dark and storms, instead of following a pillar of fire. But moving faster wasn't enough. What happened next would change the very warriors themselves. Long ago, Israel's warriors learned their skills from life itself. Fathers taught sons how to fight with spears and slings. Shepherds learned by guarding sheep from lions and bears. Hunters developed sharp eyes, tracking prey through the hills. But their greatest lesson was something no weapon could give them. They learned to trust God to guide their hands in battle. Those early fighters didn't have special training camps or battle schools. They watched older warriors and listened to stories of past victories. They learned which positions worked best for fighting in the desert, how to move quietly through rocky ground, and when to stand firm against larger forces. Before each battle, they gathered to pray and ask God for wisdom. Their training came through daily work and deep faith in the Lord's strength. Think of young David, who learned to use his sling protecting sheep. Those long days in the fields taught him more than just aim. They taught him to trust God when facing dangers. When he stood before Goliath, David knew both how to use his weapon and how to rely on God's help. This mix of skill and faith made Israel's warriors special. Today's Israeli soldiers enter a very different world. Young people now spend years learning things their ancestors never imagined. They master complex weapons that can hit targets miles away. They work with computers that track every movement on the battlefield. They learn battle plans and strategies that would seem like magic to Joshua. Modern training uses tools that would amaze those ancient warriors. Special rooms with giant screens let soldiers practice fighting in any place on Earth. They can try different battle plans without any danger. If they make mistakes, they simply start over and learn what went wrong. Where old warriors learned by doing, today's soldiers can watch recordings of their training and see exactly how to improve. Yet something beautiful connects these different times. Even with all their new tools, many soldiers still pray before training sessions. They study both old wisdom and new ways of fighting. Like their ancestors, they learn not just how to fight, but why they protect God's people. The same courage that helped David face Goliath now helps them face modern threats. This new training costs far more than the old way. Instead of just faith and simple tools, it needs expensive gear and special teachers. Each practice shot with modern weapons costs more than an ancient warrior's entire sword. But it creates defenders who can guard their people in ways the ancients never imagined. Most fascinating is how these soldiers blend old and new ways. During training, they learn to trust both their advanced tools and their spiritual strength. They depend on their team members just as ancient tribal warriors relied on their brothers in battle. They know that all their technology works best when guided by wisdom and faith. But changing how warriors train led to something even bigger. The cost of using human wisdom instead of just God's protection would surprise everyone. When ancient Israel faced huge enemy armies, they needed just two things: faith in God and courage in their hearts. Today, keeping Israel safe costs $14 billion every year. But money tells only part of this amazing story. In those ancient days, God's protection came without a price tag. When mighty armies threatened his people, the Lord fought their battles himself. Remember how he split the Red Sea, how he made Jericho's walls fall. These miracles didn't cost a single coin. God asked for only two things: trust in his power and hearts that followed his ways. Each morning those ancient people woke up, knowing the Lord watched over them. If enemies came, they didn't check their weapons or count their soldiers. Instead, they turned to God in prayer. His protection was perfect, constant, and free. Now look at modern Israel. Their safety needs huge amounts of money. Each Iron Dome missile that stops an enemy rocket costs more than a nice house. The F-35 planes that guard their skies cost more than ancient kings had in their whole treasuries. Every day, they spend huge sums keeping their defenses strong. But this new way brought some good things too. Israel now stands as one of the world's strongest nations, ranked 17th in military power. The tools they create to stay safe now help protect other nations too. Their smart defenses spot dangers early. Their special weapons hit only enemy targets, saving innocent lives. The wisdom God gave them now helps people all around the world. Modern Israel tries hard to keep both old and new ways. Their soldiers still bow their heads in prayer before checking their complex machines. They know all their amazing tools come from God's blessing. Many write prayers on their planes and tanks, just as David wrote psalms about God's protection. The cost shows up in more than money. Today's defenders must split their trust between God and technology. They spend hours fixing machines, learning new systems, and planning how to use their tools. Where ancient warriors spent their time in prayer, modern soldiers study technical manuals too. This change makes us think deep thoughts. Did Israel lose something important when they started using more human tools than divine help? Or did they just find a new way to work with God's protection? Maybe the wisest answer is that both faith and new tools can serve God's plan. But through all these changes, Israel keeps trying to honor both their old faith and their new calling. Their story shows how God's protection can work in different ways without losing its deep truth. This balance between trusting God and using new tools points to an even bigger mystery in his plan. What happened next would show something surprising about the future. Most people think miracles are things like splitting seas or making walls fall down. But what if God's greatest miracle was teaching his people to create amazing things themselves? Israel's story shows us something special about how God helps his people today. Long ago and now, Israel faces the same big test, staying safe when enemies seem too strong to beat. But look how things have changed. Moses once lifted his staff to part the waters. Now Israel's leaders lift satellites into space to watch for danger. Both ways protect God's people. The miracle didn't go away. It just changed form. This change tells us something deep about God's plan. Instead of doing everything himself, he gave his people wisdom to solve hard problems. Take the Iron Dome. This special shield doesn't just stop enemy rockets. It shows how God's gift of knowledge can work through smart machines and careful planning. Every rocket it stops proves that God's wisdom can work through today's tools. Modern Israel has done something wonderful. They've mixed their old faith with their new tools. Their soldiers study both ancient battle stories and new fighting ways. When they work with machines that cost millions, many still say the same prayers their ancestors did before fighting. They know both their faith and their smart tools come from God. This mixing of old and new shows up everywhere in Israel's defense. Their spies use both new watching tools and old wisdom about people and faith. Their computer experts guard both real borders and computer ones. Even their most advanced fighting plans remember their special history, showing how faith and new knowledge can make each other stronger. But this brings up big questions. Should we wait for God to help, or use the gifts he gave us to help ourselves? Israel's story suggests both ways can honor God. Just as he once led with a fire in the sky, he now leads by helping people create shields and tools that save lives. Both old and new times teach us important things. Ancient Israel learned to trust God fully. Modern Israel learned to trust the skills he gave them. Together, these lessons show how God can work through human hands. Their story proves that faith doesn't have to get weaker as tools get better. It can grow stronger as we see how God's gifts work. This matters a lot for tomorrow. As we make more new things, Israel shows us how to move forward without forgetting God. Their path teaches us that making new things can be a way of thanking God, using his gifts to protect life. Looking ahead, this mix of faith and new tools points to even bigger things. Israel's story isn't just about fighting power or making smart machines. It's about what people can do when God guides them. Their journey from God's direct help to using his gifts of wisdom shows how all people can learn to use God's blessings wisely. This leads us to a deep truth about how God works today. Maybe the biggest miracle isn't in old stories or new machines, but in how Israel kept its faith and purpose through such big changes. From wandering the desert with nothing but faith, to commanding some of the world's most advanced military tools, Israel's journey tells the story of God's people through time. Yet something more amazing than all their new inventions stands out: how they kept their heart and soul through such big changes. Think of this amazing truth. Those former slaves who once watched God split the sea now split atoms. The people who followed a pillar of fire now follow signals from space. Their path from trusting only in God's direct help to mastering advanced tools shows us something deep about his plan for all people. But here's what truly amazes. Through all these changes, Israel never lost who they really were. Whether facing Pharaoh's chariots or today's missiles, their trust in God's protection stayed strong. They just learned to work with God's power instead of waiting for it. Their story proves that moving forward with new tools doesn't mean leaving faith behind. It means finding new ways God works through human hands. The change from God's direct help to people's smart inventions shows something deeper about how he guides his people. Instead of doing everything himself, he gave them wisdom to solve problems on their own. Every rocket stopped by the Iron Dome, every danger spotted by their watching tools, proves how God's gifts work through human creativity. This wisdom showed up in surprising ways through history. Take Paul's story in Jerusalem's ancient streets. 40 trained killers once swore not to eat or drink until they killed him. These weren't common thugs, but skilled hunters who knew every hidden path in the city. But Paul had something they didn't expect. Not just faith, but clever thinking that God gave him. His amazing story reveals even more surprising ways that God protected his people through both heavenly and earthly means. Don't wait. Click that video now while it's on your screen.